In this tutorial, I'm going to be running through a process that we did some of in class, but we didn't finish it out, just for time constraints. And I'm going to show you this kind of cheesy crime novel cover, basically designing a book cover, in this case, a fake book cover, for a generic crime novel. And really in this case it's less about the quality of the design, more about being able to put these elements together and use them in Photoshop and handle the technical information. So I'm just going to go directly in. This is essentially what we're going to be finishing out, this cover that I have here. It probably won't be identical, just because there's quite a few little things you can do on the top to alter the look and little elements to tweak. And also I'm going to be trying to move fairly quickly. I'm going to be trying to move as quickly as I can through this because it is kind of a long process. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. The first thing that I'm going to do is open up the provided photos. This one I have that's called Photo Buildings. So I'm going to open that in Photoshop as its own canvas. And I'm also going to go ahead and blow this up. And I'm going to do File and New and open another canvas on top of that. This one is going to be sized to a book cover. Now, for the sake of this, we're going with just a standard book cover size, which would be 6 by 9 inches. It may, in some cases, also have a bleed or something like that, depending on the printer, but I'm not going to worry about it for the purpose of this. So just 6 by 9 inches. Okay, and here's my blank canvas. So this is what my final one is going to look like. My main photo, as you can see from this one, are these buildings, but they need to be repaired. They need to be fixed. Because as you can see from this photo, it's very distorted from the lens that was used to capture it, and so it's not working so far. That's going to be the first thing that we work on, is fixing the distortion on this one and putting it into our canvas, which again, just for reference sake, is, if I set it to 2 inches here, 6 by 9 inches, 300 pixels per inch, which is standard for print. 300 pixels per inch is pretty usual for print. Okay. So starting with this one, first thing, unlock the background layer. This is the only layer here, so obviously that's what we're going to be editing. And we're going to be using a function that I don't use particularly often. It's mostly to repair photos like this. If I go to the Edit menu and Transform and then Distort, this is the one that we're going to be using for this. When I click Distort, it changes just a little bit in reference to the bounding boxes up here, but what I'm going to be doing is getting these walls, these outer walls, to be more vertical rather than slanted inwards like you see them here. So I'm going to drag out a couple of guides from the side ruler to help me with this, to help me make sure I know when it actually is vertical. And how I'm going to do it is after I've selected Distort from the Transform menu, I can go up to the very top, such as on the left, and just start pulling directly to the left. And I'm going to keep pulling. I can even hold shift to make sure I don't accidentally pull this way or this way. Just hold shift and then try to get it to a mostly vertical standing on this side, and then go over to the right and start doing the same thing. You'll start seeing this balance out. I'm not going to get it perfect. I don't need to get it absolutely perfect, but I think I do want the left side to be a little bit more perfect than the right has to be. But you basically just end up going back and forth, trying to balance it out and get the look that you want. That looks about right. You can see how much I've stretched it up here on the top left, especially on the left, a little bit less on the right. And then I can hit my little check mark at the top here, or go back to my move tool, or arrow as I tend to call it. And there we go, it's finished out. You will notice one problem though. As I start to zoom in, it's not terrible. It's not terrible, but you can see I have stretched some elements like the car here a little bit more than they needed to be stretched. That was kind of inevitable through the process of fixing the warp, but what we can do to fix that is to actually take this right side in particular and just kind of scale it in a little bit. Not a lot, just a little. And that will help with some of that issue that I had before. And again, the bounding boxes that come around it so you can transform, there's a checkbox at the top that says Show Transform Controls. Just always make sure that you're aware of whether or not that is checked. So that's pretty much what I needed to accomplish with this one, of altering that warp that you get. Again, it's not going to be perfect, but altering the warp that you get from that really wide angle lens. Now I'm going to go ahead and move it to my other canvas and start positioning it. This is a pretty high res photo, so I've got a lot to work with, And when I'm planning this out, when I'm plotting out how to put this in, I'm taking into account I need a title up at the top, and I need the author's name, in this case, down at the bottom. That tends to vary from cover to cover, but on this one, I know that I'm going to have it up here in the sky area, and then also the name much smaller down below. So I'm going to actually scale this down a little bit. I want to see a little bit more of the buildings. I don't want my corner to where I warped it to show, obviously, otherwise I'd have to go in and fill that in with things like clone stamp and other long and boring processes. So I'm just going to pull that in and shift it over some, and here we go. I'm happy with that. I think that's going to work for me. Now, as you can see from the one that we're changing it over to, this is kind of a night setting, sunset, or either sunrise one. And the sky is much darker, the streets are much darker, all those things. This one is very clearly daylight, so we're going to have to go in and make some changes, the most obvious of which is going to be removing the sky. This is actually an extremely easy sky to remove, because all I have to do is go over to my lasso tool, click and hold, select the polygonal, and because these are buildings, these are all geometric, this is going to be very, very easy to do. So I'm going to zoom in really closely, as I often do, not that close, and I'm going to just start clicking from point to point so I can remove the sky. I've got a little bit of a tree or a bush or something down here, but I'm going to ignore that, pretend it's not there, and just stick to the edges of the buildings. I would probably, if I was doing this for publication, I would take the time to make sure I get all of this perfect, but I'm going to be moving a little bit quickly, just so I don't have to sit here and you don't have to watch me go through this whole process step by step. I'm already being too meticulous. My nature is taking over. Alright, one of the issues that you'll see here as far as removing the sky is between this fence. It has all these little areas of light. That is way too much complexity to deal with in this image, so I'm going to remove it entirely just by making sure not to select the fence. I'm just going to go across the top of the building and pretend like the fence is not there. So now for this last one, I'm keeping this nice and close, and once I've done that, I can zoom out and just make sure I go back to my beginning selection and close it off. Then I'll get my marching ants that lets me know you have made and confirmed a selection, and this is easy as deleting the sky out. So the next thing to do is to bring in my new sky, which I actually have right here on the desktop so I can pull it in. I'm literally just going to click and drag and bring it in. And it's going to make it too small. It's going to fit it to the canvas. This is a really high-res photo, so there's no issue with pixelation. I'm just going to scale it up to be about this size, about that size, and then confirm it. And obviously in the layers palette it's now above the buildings. This is pretty visible from the canvas as well, so I'm going to take it in the layers palette and slide it below so the buildings come up behind it. I'm also going to right click or control click on a Mac and rasterize the layer so I can edit it. See, when I brought it in, I didn't want it to come all the way down to the bottom. One of the reasons I didn't is because it has this really great kind of stormy break in the clouds up here, and I want that to come just above the top of the buildings. It's very dramatic, it's got a great look to it. So I wanted that, but the problem is, in this case, you see how it has left me with the edge of the photo visible down here on the bottom. That's going to be the first thing that we have to get rid of, because that obviously does not look right. It's an easy fix though, just by going to my eraser tool, selecting a soft eraser from the parameters at the top, making it nice and sizable, dropping the opacity down of the brush, not the layer, but of the brush, around 30%, and then just kind of softly get rid of that edge. Again, I'm erasing on the stormy sky layer. If I select anything else, I'm going to erase part of my buildings. Okay, so that already looks better, but again, this is supposed to be a night shot. So this white down here in the corner is not doing me a lot of favors towards making this feel like nighttime. So I'm going to do one more thing, and that's going to be to go down to my background layer and put above it a solid color. And when I bring in the solid color, it's going to ask what color I want to use. I'm going to pull off of the color picker so that my eyedropper shows up on the image, and then I can just click inside the image to get one of these nice moody greenish dark colors that comes up in the background. And that's what I want to be in the background of my image, rather than the white. So if I toggle off and on, you can see all it did was fill up that one corner, even though technically if I toggle off the sky, you can see that it fills the entire canvas. So that fixed my problem. That got rid of that issue of the white corner, the elusive white corner. I'm kind of checking here to make sure that everything's working well. Okay. Going through my list of what I do here in the beginning. The next thing that I'm going to do is actually begin to add the sunlight, the bloom of sunlight that's going to come in over the top of these. You can see from this one it's a very intense part of it, it's a very important part of it. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a layer above stormy sky, a completely blank layer, but below my buildings, which I'm actually going to rename to say buildings. And I'm going to, on this second layer, I'm going to name it sun. And using a brush, this is something I do a lot in photos, adding my own light source. I tend to get really good results from it. I'm going to go in and find a nice orange color and just paint that in. Something nice and intense. And then of course one of the keys to this is blending mode. With this one I did some trial and error. I chose color dodge as a blending mode for the sun. I like the effect that it has on the clouds, giving me a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red. I usually drop down the opacity about 10% or so on this one, but we're going to make another adjustment here in a minute that helps with that as well. Now one of the things that you might be thinking is, well, if the sun is coming from the background, why is the front of the buildings lit? We're going to deal with that here in a little bit. It will be consistent. As you can see, if you look over at this one, I actually have darkened them up and I put some light down at the bottom to make it look like the street lights are illuminating the buildings. So that's going to be kind of our way out of that. Okay, so we have this in. Now the next thing that I would like to do is I'm going to throw in a new color fill, this time above my stormy sky layer. So from the menu at the bottom of the layers palette to solid color, I'm going to take a blue, a grayish blue is usually what I do, around a mid-tone. I usually pull from the middle. And I'm going to set that to multiply. And it's just dealing with the sky. It's not covering the sunlight, it is just dealing with the sky because it's only over that. So what I'm going to do is actually reduce the opacity of that. You'll notice it's really dark. It's giving me kind of too intense of an effect. So I'm actually going to drop it down to about 35%. And if I toggle off and on, you can see the difference. When it's turned on, I get more detail in the clouds. I get more red in the clouds. It's actually kind of a nice effect. Okay, the next part is to actually duplicate this layer that I just used. So Command J or Control J, depending on what type of computer you're using, and scroll up to the top. And I'm putting this one over the buildings. Now obviously right now it's controlling the whole thing. I don't want it to control the whole image. I want to control click on it and do Create Clipping Mask. And that way it is only affecting the light on the buildings. And this one I'm actually going to make much darker. I'm going to bump it up to about 75%. Make it much more intense, much darker than the one behind it. And you can see I'm starting to get the mood a little bit. This is beginning to establish that mood from my sunlight background. If I look over at this other one, we're getting there little by little. One of the main elements of this, if I look over at the one we're shooting for, is you'll notice that there's headlights on the car, there's lights on the lamppost and things like that. Something that helps enhance that idea that this is nighttime. So that's one of the most important things that we're going to do here, is give the street itself the feeling of night by adding some illumination to it from other sources. So I'm actually going to zoom in. We're going to start with the car, because the car is the one that's up close, it's most prominent. And I want to make sure that I'm getting a good look from it. So at the top of everything, I'm going to create a new layer, completely blank, and call it Headlights 1. And I'm going to take a brush. I'm going to choose as a color white or something really close, maybe a little bit off, maybe even a little bit blue or something like that. And I'm going to make my brush much smaller. I'm also going to lower the opacity of the brush a great deal as well. Really low, usually 15 to 20%, something like that. Because the idea here is to create kind of that root, that beginning glow that you get inside of a light. So I'm literally going to take this small brush and just kind of go in here and add light on top of the headlights of the car. And I'm going to make it just gradually more intense. That's the reason for the low opacity, and maybe in some case even a little bit bigger so that it bleeds over some. This has to be handled with care. Otherwise you can get a really strange look from it. A very soft brush is important, low opacity is important to give you a more organic feel. I usually mess around with different blending modes for it, but because it's white you get very little difference from these other blending modes. So I think I'm just going to leave it to normal. And then add a new layer above it, and this one called Headlights 2. This one is where you actually give some of the color. So I'm going to go in and grab something warmer, something in a yellowish orange. And this one I typically set to color dodge as a blending mode beforehand, so I can kind of see the effect that it's really having. Typically even a lower opacity is important here, around 10%. And then I'm just going to start to put a little bit of that over, just ever so softly, so that it looks like from a distance there's headlights coming from the car. The next part of this is actually, in my opinion, even more fun because we get to put, like you can see here on this crime novel background. Whoops, I didn't accidentally open something in my other monitor. You can see the headlights kind of going out across the road. And that's really important. So that's one of the things that we're going to do to kind of help fill that corner, as well as just give it a more natural overall look. So I'm going to create yet another layer, and it's going to be Headlights 3. I like to keep these things separate from one another. And this one's fun because we get to use the polygonal lasso tool again. And this is where a little bit of knowledge of perspective, a little bit of knowledge of drawing comes in handy, just because I want to actually put this in a way that looks semi-realistic. So I'm using my polygonal lasso to just sketch out the basic shape of what this would look like. And when I create the selection, you can see it's like this. It has a little gap in the middle. I may have done a little bit more gap than is needed. And I'm going to take that and, using a full brush back to normal again, fill it in all the way like this. Now what we have to do with this in order to actually make it look like light is, for one thing, blending mode. That's important. I believe usually one works better than the other here. I could use screen. I could use color dodge. I think actually that's linear dodge. Color dodge. I think screen gave me kind of a more interesting, a warmer result. Now obviously right now it looks nothing like headlights because it's too harsh. So what we have to do is to filter, blur, and I'm actually going to go with the Gaussian blur. If that's how you pronounce it, that's a complete guess. Anybody's welcome to correct me there. I don't believe I've ever heard it said. But anyway, the point of this is to go in and just to add more and more blur until I get something that starts to look natural. And then just hit OK. Different blending modes for different purposes here. I'm still liking screen. I'm still thinking that one's working better. So after I've done that, I've got it laid out. I'm probably going to drop that opacity some, make it a little bit... Actually, maybe not opacity. Let's not do that. Let's leave it at 100% and instead take a soft brush at a low opacity. Mine's currently at 28%. This is the eraser brush. And as it comes towards me, I'm just going to wash it out a little bit so it feels like it's more intense towards the car. And then it gets softer as it goes in the distance. And that's actually giving me the look that I want here. That's giving me a more realistic tone. I'm glad I thought of that. That's why it helps to do these things multiple times. So I've got my lights down there. What would follow on this would be I would create a new layer, call it Streetlight 1, something like that. And then I would go in, zoom in really close. I'm not going to do a lot of these again for time's sake, but I would kind of the same thing, low opacity brush, white first. In this case, low opacity is particularly important because these are even more in the distance. And I just go and add a subtle glow to these things. maybe a little bit more inside the carriage of the light itself, especially on these. Just to continue adding light to it. And if I look closely, you can see that there's lights up here, a street light right there. There's lights way off in the distance that you could add to. I'm being very haphazard with them right now. And there's even this one, which I'll actually add that on the next layer here. That could be a red light. And then what I would do is take a small eraser, this time high opacity, and just wash out some of that behind. Now it looks like there's a red glow coming from the light. Again, I was pretty haphazard with that. That could be done to be more realistic and a lot neater. I missed a couple here, but not a huge deal. But the point of it being just to go in and add some realism. Go in and add a strong feeling of this being nighttime, which is really important. Oh, well, that's why it wasn't working. I was trying to use an eraser as a brush. Rarely works. So on and so forth. That does a decent job of it. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and move on. At this point, I've gone pretty much beyond the length of what I would do on the sheet. Now it comes down to making little taste choices as far as how we get this to look the way that we want it. One of the ways that I would do that in this case would be to throw in kind of an overall warmer tone, something that goes over the top of everything to kind of bring this together. So maybe an orange, set that to overlay, and leave very little of it, just something to provide a hint of what this is. So warming it up a little bit, you can see the difference made there is drastic. Has a huge change. The next thing to do is, in this case, I think I'm going to go ahead and do a sharpening. I'm going to create a group here, and I'm going to call it my main image. And I'm going to take everything I've done so far and drop it into this folder and close it down. Now that's going to stay there, that's going to be protected, so that on top of it I can create two duplicates using Command J and merge them down into images and put them in their own folder called Sharpen. This is a method I've shown multiple times in different videos. It just gives me a great result, so I use it a lot. With the top image here, of these two that I just made, I'm going to hit Command I to invert, and then I'm going to set that one as a blending mode to Vivid Light. Then I'm going to set the blending mode of this entire folder to Overlay, and with this one I'm going to do Filter, this Vivid Light image that I just did, Filter, Blur, Surface Blur. And what this is going to allow me to do is the more blur I add, the more it kind of inverts it and turns it into a sharpening method, a kind of interesting sharpening method. So depending on what radius I choose here, I can get more or less. I think I'm actually going to go for a little bit more, and then I can adjust that later just by reducing the opacity of that folder. I think 8. 8's a little bit better. So then I can take that, I can drop it down if I want it softer, I can raise the opacity if I want it, if I want it softer, and then raise it if I want it sharper. It had a little bit of a chaotic effect down here at the bottom, so I'm going to drop it down some. Actually kind of experimenting on something here. Yeah, I rather like that. On top of it, I knew I wanted to darken this more, so I threw in a solid color into the sharpen folder, and because the folder is set to overlay, it just kind of gives me an interesting result from it. So just darkening the image a little bit overall. Don't want to take it too far. I just want to get it closer to what we had on this original one here, which honestly I think I'm in the ballpark now. So I think this is already on the path towards looking like what I want. I am going to make one really important change, especially now that I have added the streetlights going back into my original ones. You remember we put the shadow over the top of the buildings. Well, I want to select the mask of that, And I'm going to soften up, I'm going to reduce the shadow on the front and bottom, kind of like you see here. So it feels like the streetlights are illuminating the front of the building. This is going to require more work from the polygonal lasso tool, where I'm going to select it, and going up top to bottom, I'm going to keep this pretty loose. I am only selecting the fronts of the building, not the sides, not the shadowed areas, only the very front. So, just drawing that out, making the selection. And I guess I'll let it, kind of light the whole street a little bit. I don't have any problem with that. So I'll leave that open to be selected as well. And here's what we'll do. Because I have the mask selected on this solid color, I can remove it by taking just a black color brush. I'm going to do low opacity like I usually do with a brush, and just start to brush out some of the darkness. That gives me such a more dynamic look than I had before, and I really like that about it. So after I've done that, Command D, got a completely different look now with a stronger focal point down towards the bottom, drawing our attention to the detail and the action. And I could at this point even, still inside of this layer, let's say I create a new one and call this Windows. This obviously would take a long time. I'm just going to do one as an example. I can select one of these windows, again with the polygonal lasso tool. And I'm just going to fill it with some intense color. Set that to color dodge or something like that. There we go, Command D to deselect. Probably lower the opacity a little bit, but hey, why not? Let's mess with it some. And then I can do something like filter and blur and give it not as intense of a blur, but maybe a little bit of one. So that from a distance it looks like some of the windows are lit. I feel like the opacity is a little high there. Maybe it shouldn't be as high, or maybe it ought to be a warmer color. I'm unsure. This is the first time I've actually tried that. I just thought, hey, why not throw it in? So you could make some changes to light some of the windows coming out of the building. I'm not totally happy with that one though, so I'm going to remove it for the time being. But the point being to overall kind of give you a sense of a city street at night. And coming from where we did with that really intensely bright photo, I feel like this has gone pretty well. I'm not going to take the time to put in the titles and things like that. That's pretty much just the type tool and playing around with your settings. The only other thing that I'm going to do is throw in a texture over the top. And I'm going to do that by the same as I did before, just kind of pulling in one that I have ready to go. In this case, I think rotating it. Actually, let's not do that. Let's keep the dark area up in this corner and bring it down to cover the whole thing. Rasterize that. Set it to, let's say, overlay. Now obviously whenever you put in a texture at full 100%, it's way too intense. It creates a huge mess. So the best thing to do is take it down to 0 and then bring it up just a little gradually until you start to get the look that you want. A lot of times with a texture, 25% is more than enough. You can see just a hint of how it's affecting the image, and overall it gives you kind of a gritty look. I think that's pretty much what I needed from it. I don't need much else. So this turned out pretty well. This is the process that we use for the files that I provided to give yourself kind of this moody crime novel cover, using just a few photos and adding a whole lot of element, especially when it comes to light and shadow. Again, this is where we started, daytime. This is where we are, nighttime, sunset, daybreak, however you want to look at it.